This is Dan Dicks here reporting for Press for Truth. The 75th annual NATO summit has just wrapped up. This, of course, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization summit, where Justin Trudeau just pledged that Canadians will be giving an additional $500 million in military support towards the war effort in Ukraine. This comes on top of the already $4 billion in munitions and arms that Canada has already donated and pledged. So this really should have a lot of people asking this question: how much is each NATO country spending on its military in 2024? And the answer, folks, is that the 32 members of the world's most powerful military alliance will spend $1.47 trillion this year alone. NATO is holding the final day of its three-day summit in Washington, D.C. to mark its 75th anniversary. On Wednesday, the world's most powerful military alliance formally declared Ukraine was on an irreversible path to NATO membership and pledged to provide Kiev with at least $43 billion in military aid. So, do they want to work towards peace here? Or does it look more so like they want to prolong this war and continue to poke the bear and ramp up the efforts to eventually usher us into a World War III type scenario with Russia? Guys, we're going to talk about all of that and much more in this video. But really quickly, just before we do, I'd ask that you check me out here at pressfortruth.ca/donate if you appreciate my efforts to bring you this info. Guys, here you can do a one-time donation with PayPal. You can do Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies. You could sign up at this Patreon alternative for a monthly reoccurring contribution. You can do so here as well at Subscribestar. $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever is within your means is very greatly appreciated, guys. You can also send an e-transfer to dan@pressfortruth.ca, or you can send stuff to my P.O. box, guys. Links for all of this is located in the description below. Thank you so much to everybody who takes 1 minute today to support my efforts here at Press for Truth. All right, guys, Volodymyr Zelensky has just said, "I'm grateful to Justin Trudeau for announcing an additional assistance package to Ukraine worth 500 million Canadian taxpayer dollars. This will strengthen our heroes on the battlefield." Today, together with Canada's Prime Minister, we discussed Ukraine's defense needs and coordinated cooperation within the coalition of fighter jets. We also discussed the expansion of training missions for Ukrainian pilots and the possibility of additional training on Canadian flight simulators. And here Justin Trudeau says Canada plans to reinforce Ukraine's defense with $500 million more in military support and train more Ukrainian fighter pilots to defend their skies against Russia. And that's been the narrative all along, is that Russia is the big bad aggressor here who we need to defend poor little old Ukraine against. But when you really look at the history of who the aggressors are, it's quite clear, folks. You can see that in this video that depicts exactly what's been happening since the early 1990s. And you just look at how NATO continued to expand their alliance eastwards towards the Russian border, exactly like they promised they would not do. You know, this is the declaration. This is what was signed back in 1990. Where NATO agreed that they would not expand their jurisdiction and their forces of NATO 1 inch to the east. But as we've seen and as this video here depicts, exactly that has been happening since the early 90s. And you can only kind of poke that Russian bear and push it into a back corner so much before it's going to react, you know. And now here we are, Canadian taxpayers committing an extra $500 million in military assistance as NATO rallies around Ukraine. This is just insane. Canada pledged to commit an additional $500 million in military assistance to Ukraine this year, the federal government said on the sidelines of the NATO summit. The announcement late Wednesday capped a day where the 32-member alliance clearly felt that the political pressure of war is going badly. NATO delivered a long-sought commitments and reassurance, stating that in its official declaration, the Eastern European country is on an irreversible path to membership. The additional money, on top of the projected $4 billion in arms and munitions Canada has already pledged and donated, came following a bilateral meeting between Trudeau and Zelensky at the Washington summit. The majority of the funding will go towards a NATO-led 40 billion euro initiative that aims to provide the war-ravaged country with steady financing and predictable military support. So again, this begs the question, are they working towards a time of peace, or are they trying to proactively prolong this war? And again, clearly we are seeing NATO pushing up against the Russian border, poking the big bad bear. And, look, I'm not like sitting here defending Putin or defending Russia in any way, shape, or form. I mean, every country and leader in this day has their own various problems, and we can talk about all of that. But I think it's clear here what's going on when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture. I'd have to agree with this guy who was saying on Twitter, Putin didn't destroy Iraq, the U.S. and NATO did. Putin didn't destroy Afghanistan, the U.S. and NATO did. Putin didn't destroy Yugoslavia, Libya, and Syria. The U.S. and NATO did that. Putin and Russia is not the problem. And like I said, I'm not sitting here defending Putin or Russia here, but there is a massive amount of propaganda that's been going on over the last couple of decades in regards to Russia's relationship with Ukraine, Ukraine's relationship with Russia, how NATO plays into the whole scenario, and a lot of it is being left out in today's mainstream news. So I want to leave you today with a little, 5-minute clip of a little bit of a brief history that I broke down a couple of years ago in this video here, The Truth About Russian Aggression in Ukraine, where in this video I delve behind the headlines into the history of Ukraine and Russia's relationship with NATO, the US and their allies, to reveal a situation that looks nothing like what the MSM is presenting. So turn off your TVs, stop being conditioned for war, and support real independent media like Press for Truth. So I want to leave you with that short, just a short, like 5 or 6 minute clip of myself a couple years ago breaking down the history and the narrative that you're not getting from the mainstream media that is so important for context today, especially when we're talking about contributing $500 million in Canadian taxpayer money to the war effort. If there was ever a reason for you to stop paying taxes, now might be a good one, folks. So let me leave you with this brief history here of how we've gotten to this point. And again, I want to remind you, if you do appreciate my efforts to do so, don't forget to check me out here at pressfortruth.ca/donate. Thank you so much to everybody who takes 1 minute today to support my efforts here at Press for Truth. All right, guys, this is the truth about Russian aggression in Ukraine. Don't forget to click the thumbs up button and share this video, and we will have more video reports coming soon. But for now, check out this brief history for important context that is very much needed as the Canadian government, NATO, and their alliances are ramping up the war efforts here and potentially marching us towards World War III. This is a short clip from my video, The Truth About Russian Aggression in Ukraine. So how did we get to this point where the West is frothing at the mouth and ready to incite violence against Russia, and the Ukrainians are ready to start killing Russians, including children. Well, in order to understand the media manipulation that's happening today, we must first look at Ukraine and how the media has already manipulated its history in regards to its relationship with Russia. Back in 1990, the Soviet Union agreed to let East Germany escape Soviet control. And the agreement was that NATO would not push east into the former Soviet satellites. The agreement was that there would always be a buffer zone between the West and Russia. Well, despite agreeing to this exchange, the US and NATO broke their pledge almost immediately. And NATO is now in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And the US-led alliance has literally been creeping up against Russia's border all this time. US anti-missile systems are in Poland, and new US bases have been set up in Bulgaria and Romania and Central Asia. And yet, Russia is supposed to be the aggressor here? It seems clear to me that NATO has become the Fourth Reich. And please don't get me wrong, Russia and Putin are certainly not perfect. After a previous war with Chechnya, which left the former USSR embarrassed, Putin used a second war with Chechnya in order to make himself look like a strong leader. And one of the ways that he got support from the Russians to fight against the Chechnyan separatists was to commit false flag attacks. The FSB, which is like Russia's CIA, blew up apartment buildings and blamed it on Chechnya. Residents had actually called the police on 2 suspicious men who dropped off packages in the basement of a building. The bomb squad was called, and an explosive called RDX was found, which was meant to take down the entire building. Then the roads were shut down, a huge manhunt ensued, and the 2 men were caught, and they turned out to be the FSB. At first, they said they were testing the police's vigilance, but then later it came out that this was just a training exercise. So we can see the parallels between Western leaders and Putin because both of them use false flag attacks to increase their power. The CIA and the FSB seem to be governments unto themselves. So Putin is certainly no angel, but if you get all your information solely from the mainstream media, you will believe that Putin is the devil, the US is God, and intervention is absolutely necessary, of course, all under the guise of a humanitarian mission. This, of course, is not true, but if we were to entertain this idea, why should Canada intervene? What is it about Putin's leadership that interferes with the daily lives of Canadians? The answer is, it doesn't. The fact is, NATO is not equipped to go to war over Ukraine, and the Russians have home turf advantage. And no one in Europe, aside from maybe a few Ukrainian nationalists, want a war with Russia. The loudest voices for war are the neocons in Washington and Ottawa, who, of course, are separated by about 8,000 kilometers of mostly ocean. And not to mention, it's not going to be Trudeau or Biden going to war, but rather it will be the brave men and women who have sadly been brainwashed and conditioned into thinking this is a humanitarian mission and that they're fighting for our freedoms. The truth is, there are no economic benefits to having any kind of sanctions on Russia. In fact, all this does is it hurts Canadian exporters and it targets individual Russian citizens. There is no national security risk from Russia. Ukraine is just simply not a place that's worth going to war over right now. What if Ukraine could just exercise self-determination? Can you imagine that? Wouldn't that be more democratic? Instead, we have these so-called democratic Western leaders promoting their version of their militarized form of democracy. It's the same vision that they had for Egypt and Libya and Iraq. And just look how well those thriving democracies are doing. The fact is, the US and NATO took an internal Ukrainian conflict, and by intervening on the side of anti-Russian Ukrainians, they made a mountain out of a molehill. And they've also incited what could potentially become a nuclear showdown between the West and Russia. But just like any wounded animal who's backed into a corner, the Russian bear can be vicious. We have to remember that Russia is a nuclear powerhouse, and the globalist infiltration of China isn't exactly rock solid. There is a power dynamic between the West and the East, and our Western leaders have been on top for so long that they're now getting cocky and dangerous. And of course, my friends, while the true power lies within the banking dynasty, who has funded and armed both sides of this conflict, there's no money to be made and no power vacuums to be filled without conflict. The global elite now depend on the West hating Russians and the Russians hating the West. So as Canadians or Americans or wherever you reside, unless the individual masses make their voices heard, that we will not put up with these wars of aggression, we are just going to simply sit on the sidelines and be a part of the problem. And one of the best things you can do right now is to stop being brainwashed by the mainstream media who have become expert liars and manipulators of information. And instead, start supporting real independent media like Press for Truth, who's not afraid to counter all the propaganda and to bring you the truth of what's actually happening. Please, my friends, click that thumbs up button and share this video with your friends and family who you think need to see it the most. And if you appreciate my efforts to bring you this information, please consider making a donation or contributing as a member at pressfortruth.ca/donate. That's it for today, my friends. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned. We're going to have more video reports coming soon. This is Dan Dicks reporting for Press for Truth. We all want truth. The truth will set you free.